Ladies and gentlemen, I think it would have been so nice if I could have stood here and blamed load shedding for the delayed start, or ESCOM for that matter, but unfortunately, it's a glitch that we had to sort out in-house here. But please do accept my apologies for the delayed start. I think we're starting 13 and a half minutes late, but I believe that as we go along, we'll more than compensate for the lost time. My name is Dr. Elias Parker, and I'm the chairperson of the Academia Library, the organization that's hosting this series of talks. Brothers and sisters from all over the world, I greet you with the greetings of peace. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, and a very pleasant and warm good morning to one and all. At a time when the whole world is in turmoil as a result of the ongoing genocide in Gaza, Academia Library plans to have a series of talks related to this event. In my view, a catastrophe. We are honored to have assembled panelists from all over South Africa and the world, and who are specialists in the area of Zionism and the ongoing Nakba, as I said, a catastrophe in many ways. But they are also not just sedentary academics. They have for years been actively campaigning against the Zionist regime and its atrocities since before 1940. Perhaps an important note as to the existence and the flourishing or the sustaining of Academia Library. Academia Library and its work is supported by good people like your good selves. We are not a profit engineering driven entity. In fact, no income stream whatsoever. We have and continue to depend on the good-heartedness of philanthropists such as yourselves to continue to support the Academia Library as you have done for the last 4.5 odd years. In fact, to make it easy for you, we have a donation box outside, and because we know that in the current climate, not many people carry too much cash around anymore, we're also having a card machine, so we beseech you to please contribute generously towards the programs that the Academia Library wish to continue to have. It gives me now great pleasure to introduce our speakers, our panelists for this morning. First up would be Dr. Mohammed Ayesh. He was born and raised in Silwan, Al-Quds, before immigrating to Canada, where he is now a professor of sociology at the Mount Royal University. He is the author of Hermeneutics of Violence, and has recently finished writing books, Lordship and Liberation of Palestine and Israel. He has also co-edited 2 books, the most recent with Jeremy Wilderman, titled Canada as a Settler Colony, on the question of, yes, Palestine. He is also the author of multiple book chapters and has written opinion pieces for Al Jazeera, The Baffler, Middle East Eye, etc. Professor Ayash, it gives me great pleasure to extend a very warm welcome to you, and thank you for availing yourself, your time and effort to share these precious moments with us. The next speaker would be Dr. Ramzi Baroud. Dr. Ramzi Baroud is a journalist and the editor of the Palestine Chronicle. He's the author of 6 books. His latest book, co-edited with Professor Ilan Pape, is Our Vision for Liberation: Engaged Palestinian Leaders and Intellectuals Speak Out. His other books include My Father Was a Freedom Fighter, Gaza, United Story, and The Last Earth. Dr. Baroud is a non-resident senior research fellow at the Center of Islamic and Global Affairs. Dr. Ramzi was in Europe when we unfortunately engaged him for him to join us, and as I said, unfortunately, had to be back in the United States, where time now is roughly around 2 a.m. And I think they're getting ready for Sehri. So unfortunately, he could not be live streamed here this morning. However, he has sent his contribution, which we will play to you and relate to you via the audio visual. Dr. Ramzi, in your absence, we thank you for your contribution. Our last panelist is our own Dr. Connie Benson. She is an historian, organizer, and an award-winning educator. She's also a senior lecturer at the Department of History at the University of the Western Cape. Excuse me. Dr. Connie Benson is a South African convener of the revolutionary papers of Know Your Continent, a popular education history initiative. Her research focuses on mobilization, demobilization, and remobilization of struggle history in Southern Africa's past and present. She's an active member of the South African Jews for Free Palestine. Dr. Coney Benson, once again, we welcome and thank you for being here and your contribution. Ladies and gentlemen, these are our esteemed panelists for today. I would now like to digress. You may continue. I would now like to digress for a few minutes and like to call upon Professor Yusuf Chikte to present us with a brief overview of the current resistance programs organized locally by the Palestinian campaign. Ladies and gentlemen, I give you Professor Yusuf Chikte.
Thank you, Ilyas, and Assalamu alaikum to everybody. And thank you for allowing me to speak of the activities of the Palestine Solidarity Campaign. We are a non-sexist, non-racial, secular organization, and that is our unique and distinct contribution, I think, to this to Palestinian solidarity in South Africa, in that we embrace those kinds of values as enshrined in our constitution, which is a searchlight for what we're trying to achieve in Palestine, also with Palestine solidarity organizations, with the Palestinians. Globally, at a global front, what we are, we were active at 3 levels: at the IJC, through DIRCO, the Department of International Relations, in pushing this court case, but that was very much undercover together with other organizations. We also are pushing very hard at the ICC, International Criminal Code, to hold Israelis accountable for the genocide that is taking place. We also, an important development, what we engage with currently is the Global Anti-Apartheid Conference, due to take place between the 10th and the 12th. And as you could imagine, in Johannesburg, where we go at the behest of Palestinian civil society to hold Israel accountable with respect to the Apartheid Convention at the UN, for us to push through the D and the S part of BDS, the divestment and sanctions part of the BDS campaign. So that's an important development. And as you can imagine, it's going to be very contested given the recent developments of what is taking place in Palestine. The news that came out this morning, the appointment of a prime minister, despite things that have happened in Moscow, of a unity government, of a retention of the unity of the land, the unity of the people, the unity of the struggle. So that has been given a body blow by the PA currently, and we, through our efforts of education and advocacy, want to put the spotlight on that in terms of what is happening. So we are embarking on a series of campaigns locally, and one of our activities is going to be the Palestinian writers who are going to come on Friday the 22nd at AIDC to engage with us and to bring out those themes. And we're also having Mansour Soman to speak to us on Friday from 2 p.m. to 4 p.m. From 4 p.m. to 6 p.m. And you'll get the posters coming out soon to highlight those kinds of issues. And the focus of the theme will be the conclusion of the genocide in Palestine through the shrinkage of Gaza and the legalization of the illegal settlements and escape routes, repopulation of the Palestinians via the pier or in the Negev, and with the support of the regimes surrounding them, the Arab regime surrounding them, NATO land and the EU. So those are broad activities. We're also quite active on the streets, and you must please join us. And we encourage, we've developed a model of, with others of course, of street protests at mosques, at faith-based organizations, And in collaboration with them, and some of you know, you've been at the St. George's Cathedral around that, at mosques. Recently, we've had at several mosques, there are these spontaneous demonstrations to keep that narrative alive. And so we're doing that. But yesterday, what we did was to protest at SAFA, to bring about a resolution to call for the boycott, for the expulsion of Israel from FIFA. And so we're pressurizing that, and we're pressurizing the whole African continent to do that. We're also very active in the sports boycott at SASROC to kick Israel out of the Olympics. So those are some of the kinds of campaigns that we're doing. And if Ilyas is walking closely, then slowly, then I must close down. But I think you're all familiar, so please come and support us. Give expression to your support for Palestinians through these activities. And I just want to emphasize that we want a big part of our effort is the single-minded purpose of the PSC is to dismantle Israeli apartheid with its settler colonial apparatus fueled by Zionism, and those are the three-pronged lines around which we conduct ourselves. And it has, Rahmat has reminded me that it has reawakened a consciousness in South Africa about our own unresolved struggle, and we're active in the Cape Winelands, the Southern Cape, and we've linked our struggles with local struggles as well, at the labor front and at the farm worker front, women with farmers. Yesterday we stood in solidarity with the Congolese. So in a nutshell, it's an anti-imperialist fight, and which the brunt of which is being borne by the Palestinians, and the battering ram for that is Israel, which has its tentacles in many other parts of the world. Thank you.
Thank you, Yusuf. I thought I'm going to have to jump on your back to stop. But indeed, you know, the contribution of the PSC in our struggle, in our fight against injustices, against atrocities, against the genocide is indeed appreciated and noted. Ladies and gentlemen, it now gives me great pleasure to introduce none other than the anchor for this morning's panel discussion. I ask you to put your hands together for a man that might have gray hair, but he's a young person at heart. He's got a youthful outlook towards life. I have the pleasure to give you Mr. Shabuddin Rumane.
Assalamu alaikum and good morning, everyone. I'm not going to delay the talk too much. I think it's important that we proceed with why we are here today. It's something that we need to address constantly. My only concern is that there's this kind of new fatigue that's starting to set in, and I'm concerned that if we don't keep the momentum going with talks of this nature, with quality people of this nature, we're going to start slowing down, and we cannot afford to do that. We're witnessing almost unprecedented barbarism by the Zionist occupiers in Israel. And that is why we thought it important to bring together like-minded people who understand that if we don't almost have a bulwark against what's happening, it could happen in other regions. It could happen here, by the way. If we're not careful, that we make our stand as ordinary human beings who have a heart, who understand that the barbaric behavior of a particular group of people can infect others as a virus, and it could spread worldwide. So that's part of why we thought we would have the series of talks that we're having from today, next week, Sunday, inshallah, and then also the following Sunday. So without further ado, I'm going to ask Dr. Muhannad Ayash to give us a brief kind of understanding of the topic of today in the way he understands it. And luckily for us, Dr. Muhannad at very short kind of notice agreed to stand in for Minister Naledi Pandor, who we were going to have present today. But unfortunately, I think there's a major meeting apparently somewhere that the President has called for today, and she's unavailable to be with us today. So, but I think the replacement is probably more than adequate. Dr. Mohammed Ayaz.
No pressure.
Yeah, thank you very much. I really appreciate the invitation. I appreciate the organizers for organizing this event, for inviting me. I can't replace Lady Pandor, so I'm just going to speak as myself. And I thank you all for coming. Really appreciate you making the time on this Sunday morning, and Ramadan Mubarak and Kareem to you all as well. What I wanted to focus on in my 15 or 20 minutes or so is to kind of give you some sort of conceptual tools for understanding paths of action for the liberation of Palestine. I'm not going to spend any time on the reality. We know it. I'm not talking to a room here that doesn't follow what is actually happening. We know it's Israeli settler colonialism. We know it's apartheid. We know it's a genocide. So how do we liberate Palestine? How do we liberate the Palestinian people? One of the questions that you have to constantly ask yourself in that path of action that we've all taken here is, A, how much traction do we have on the streets and among the people in our society, wherever that is, because the Palestinian liberation struggle is a global struggle. It is taking place in very diverse areas across the world. And so you have to ask yourself that, how much traction do we have among the masses, among, the majority of the people in our society? And, how are we going to achieve the results that we want? We have to think in those ways, right? The liberation of Palestine is a long-term struggle. It has been going on for over 100 years. It might happen for many, many more years to come. I hope it doesn't take that many more years. I hope it happens soon, but you have to be prepared for this to also last another 100 years. And we can't give it up. We can't give up the fight until there is liberation. But even if it does last that long, we have to continuously ask ourselves, how far are we along this path? What do we need to do to achieve the results that we want to achieve? And here, let me just bring in basic concepts from the field of social movements. That's part of what I study as a sociology professor, is social movements. And these are not new concepts. Charles Tilly wrote these, a very famous sociologist, passed away now, of social movement. He wrote these in the 1990s. People were talking about this in the 1980s, even before. But just because they're a bit old doesn't mean that they're still not good. Doesn't mean that they're not relevant. He argued that when you're looking at how much success are you having as a social movement campaign, you look at four main categories. You look at worthiness, you look at unity, you look at numbers, and you look at commitment. And you try to give yourself a score on these 4 points. And of course, the higher your score is on all four, the better chances you have at succeeding at your campaign. You can also, by the way, achieve very high grades in all four and still not get your goal if the structural conditions are really stacked up against you. But you should, as activists, as people who are engaged in action, you should continuously ask yourself, how are we doing on these four categories? And in a nutshell, worthiness, are we communicating the worthiness of the cause? Are we good at explaining what is so worthy about this cause that deserves people's attention? Because everything in grassroots action, you need to capture people's attention. People are very busy with their lives. The majority of people are just living paycheck to paycheck, and they have many other concerns on their minds other than an academic matter. So you need to be able to communicate the worthiness of the cause to people. You need to have unity among your ranks, that you're able to work with each other across your differences. You're going to have differences within your own organization and certainly within the different organizations that are fighting for the same cause. So how are we doing on maintaining some kind of unity? Unity does not mean that you agree on everything or that you get along, or that you even like each other. I've been around this scene long enough to know that there's a lot of interpersonal stuff that happens within social movements, within organizations, between organizations. I don't work with this organization because I don't like that person. That stuff happens. It's normal, it's going to happen, but are you still maintaining unity for the service of the cause despite those things. Numbers, how many people are you getting involved in your movement? Not just the organizers, but are you getting people to sign your petitions? Are you getting people to email your politicians? Are you getting people to show up on the streets? Are you getting people to give their money? Are you getting people to give their time, their resource, their skills to your cause? Those kinds of things. And commitment. Are you ready for a long-term commitment in your struggle, that you're committed to do this until the end, until you achieve your goal? So, of course, I think all of you should be asking yourselves these questions, all the time. Not every day, obviously, but you evaluate them every once in a while to see how you're doing in those regards. But the one that I want to focus on today is numbers, because ultimately, what we do need, the road to liberation, we need numbers for it, because the road to liberation is basically BDS. It's to isolate Israel politically, economically, and legally. There's no other path. The only other path is war. There's only two. You're not talking yourself out of this. You're not going to wait for Israeli elections to save the day. None of that is happening. They've had 75 years to change. They've not changed. They're not going to.
They've gone worse.
Exactly. So only that kind of pressure will put so much pressure on the Israeli society and the Israeli state that they go, we have to change. So that has to be economic isolation, political isolation, legal isolation, meaning legal repercussions for their actions. So how do we get there? You need numbers for something like this. You need to generate a lot of grassroots pressure on institutions around the world to then enforce BDS on the Israeli state. There is no other path forward. So because of that, because we need a lot of numbers, I want to spend a little time on that. Now, here is where different contexts will have different calculations when it comes to numbers. You know the South African context way better than I do. I've only been here 1 month. So you know it better than I do. You know where you need numbers specifically. You might not need huge numbers on the streets and protests. In London they do. In Canada they do. In the US they do, because the governments are totally against, not just against BDS, but against Palestinian liberation. They're against the very idea of Palestinian freedom. They're part of the problem. They'll be the last to fall in line, I should say. They'll be the very last to fall in line. The UK, Canada, the US, etc. And I'm going to get into that shortly, by the way. Here, your government is listening to you. Your government not only is listening to you, it's taking concrete action. I know you want more, and you should ask for more. Don't get me wrong. And you do need numbers for all of that too. But it's not the same way as Canada. It's not the same way as the UK. I mean, we look at what the South African government has done in terms of the ICJ case, the genocide case, and we're in awe of it. As a Palestinian, I can tell you it means a lot to me. Reading the case that they put forward was extremely moving. It was not just politically important, but it was emotionally moving for me and many other Palestinians to see our story being told in an institution like that in the way that we would have told our story. It never happens. So absolutely. So you still need numbers, but you might not need them on the street. You might need them in a different way. And you would know that better than I do how you might need them, but we'll kind of get into that discussion shortly. Now, when you are trying to gather more numbers, it's always important to keep in mind that you don't need everybody. There's no social movement that ever needs, 100% of the population to get on board. You don't even need 80%. You don't even need 70%. You get 40%, you're doing really good. You're doing really good. You get to 50%, oh my God. The sky's the limit to what you can achieve. You don't need 100%. So keep that in mind. Don't get frustrated by the idea that you can't get everybody on board. You don't need everybody. From the population that's not going to join you, you're going to have some that just don't care. There are apolitical people. There are a dime a dozen. And I wouldn't spend too much time on them. If you're like, this person is just so apolitical, it's not worth my time, then it's not worth your time. Try. If it doesn't work, it doesn't work. Now, the ones that you don't waste your time with are political adversaries. You have to come to grips with the fact that you have political adversaries. You have political adversaries here, everywhere, right? And political adversaries, I don't engage with to change their mind. I'm engaging with them in a political battle. I'm trying to defeat them, not change their mind. There's a difference. Don't waste your emotional energy, your just time, your energy, on trying to change the minds of adversaries. You're just trying to defeat them. That's it. And when we get Palestinian liberation, there will be adversaries that will not be happy. And all right, you're not happy. I don't care. We're not on the same side. We're opponents. Political adversaries are there to be defeated. And that's how you have to think about it. You have to have that mindset. So now we're starting to kind of head down that road of, okay, so we do need lots of numbers. We need BDS to work on two levels. We need it to work on institutional levels within a state, but we also need states to adopt it. I can tell you this. The two are interrelated, but we won't get the freedom that we want, the liberation that we want, until there's states on board with BDS. States have to sanction the Israeli state. Institutions can't do it. We can't do it from the ground up. We can do boycott right now, right? Like I hope everybody here is doing it, right? Boycott is something that you can do as individuals. You can still ask institutions, and we should ask institutions to participate in that boycott. That takes it a whole other level. Divestment, that we can't really do you can do it as individuals in terms of which investment you do, you put your money in, which bank you take your money to, that sort of thing. But ultimately, for divestment to take off, you also need institutions on board for that to really take off. Sanctions, only states can really do that. And that is a critical one, sanctions. That will have a very strong effect and will, in fact, isolate the Israeli state. So there's things you can do in individual, things that you can do on an institutional level within your state, and then you want your state to also change its behavior. Now, some of the obstacles, so when you start to think, okay, so that's the road I have ahead. So what are the things that I need to consider? So, and this is, in the literature on social movements. Okay, so you have to understand four things. You have to understand the context in which you're working. South Africa is very different than Canada, very different than China, very different than India, et cetera, very different. Egypt. We need work in all those places, right? So you have to understand your context. You also have to understand what are the obstacles that are in your way within your context, and then you have to understand, okay, what actions am I able to take to address those obstacles, and then you have to have an understanding of your goals. So the goals is BDS. So let's kind of just put that one to the side. The goal is to get your institutions and state to implement BDS against the Israeli state. So that one's easy. Context, again, there's no universal answer to that. For you, it's going to be very different, like I said, than other places. But usually you're trying to, when it comes to context, you're trying to read things like political calculations, sort of intra-state politics of elections and that sort of thing, where you might have leverage, where you might not, which party is worth your time, which party is just like political adversaries, no point. Like in Canada, I don't talk to the Conservative Party. Why would I? They're adversaries, end of discussion. Liberals, for me, the same. But I like that others are more working a little bit more within the Liberals. It's not a lost fight. I can't bother myself with it, but I'm glad others do. NDP, which is our leftist party, okay, that's the one that we can switch. Put more effort into that. So these are the sort of context things that you try to understand in your own situation. Obstacles. So there are many, and perhaps during the discussion we can talk about some of the specific obstacles that you face here, whether trying to get universities to adopt a BDS or arts institutions. My first day here, I met a few artists, or not first week here, I met a few young artists who mentioned to me that here many artists would love to be openly talking about Palestine, but are too afraid because a lot of their bread and butter from art institutions are highly Zionist. And they're in an understandable situation. Like, well, how do I make a living and still be myself in terms of my political beliefs? So these are obstacles that you can discuss. But the major obstacle that I want to focus on today when it comes to states adopting BDS is US imperialism. This is the major obstacle for states to adopt BDS. I really do think that there are many states around the world, forget the West. The West is going to be the last to fall in line. But I think there's many states around the world that are really actually ready and would like to participate in an isolation of the Israeli state. But they don't because of their fear of American imperialism. I think that's the case here. I think that the South African government would not be all that opposed to the idea of sanctions against Israel, of total isolation of Israel. I think they're not so much afraid of losing some big trade agreement with the Israeli state. They could probably survive that. I know they have economic agreements. They could probably survive not having those anymore. What they can't survive is a US punishment for adopting BDS. I get that. When a politician tells you that, I don't view that politician as a coward. I don't view that politician as trying to make excuses for no good reason. I get it. If you're dependent on American economic relationships, withdrawing that will have serious consequences for your people. It's a legitimate concern. What I do have a problem with is if the conversation ends there. That I have a problem with. Okay, so now an obstacle is dependence on American economic power, American imperialism. So how do we deal with that problem? Well, so we have this obstacle of dependence on American economic power, which is basically the definition of imperialism. I know Connie will unpack that a lot more in her talk. So what do we do with that? Obviously, the best answer to that is, well, we want the world to become less dependent on American economic power, to weaken American imperialism. Fantastic. That's years away. BRICS is starting to move towards that direction, but that's years and years away. The Palestinian people do not have years. And there's a way, I think, to speed up this process of weakening American power. If the countries around the world cannot fight the threat of US punishment by going somewhere else, then the other option is to raise the price for the US itself for enforcing that punishment. You want to create such a situation where the US goes, well, if I punish them, I'm going to even lose more than they will. Or at least I'm going to lose so much that I don't want to now punish them. So how do you do that? If states do BDS on their own, they won't be able to have that calculation, raise that calculation for the US. So to me, it's incumbent on middle powers, including South Africa, to now form a coalition of states that then engage in BDS. If you form a coalition of states, it becomes much more costly for the US to punish them all. The US benefits from all the economic reliance that every state has on it. If it starts to withdraw and punish people and punish states for that, then they stop making money too. They're gangsters, basically. They really are. On the world stage. That's how gangsters make money. They're loan sharks, if you watch mob movies. So if they can no longer do that with a lot of people, meaning a lot of states, then it's no longer beneficial for them. So I think that has to be the step that states take at this moment. I'm talking about states like South Africa, Brazil, Colombia, Egypt, Morocco, even some European ones that could be brought into such a coalition like Norway, maybe even Spain, Ireland. If you start, Chile, if you start to form a coalition like that says all at the same time, as a coalition, we are cutting ties with the Israeli state, it is not that easy for the US to punish them all. Moreover, you can start to have states that already at least claim officially not to have diplomatic ties with the Israeli state, not to have economic ties with the Israeli state, to actually also join the coalition to make it politically more difficult for the US. Countries like Saudi Arabia, Malaysia, Indonesia, Pakistan, Algeria, these are big countries, big economies. If you start to get something like that going, it can create momentum. It can create a coalition of states, like I said, that makes it much more difficult for the US to punish everyone. Just like we say in our grassroots activism, there is strength and safety in numbers. That really is a thing. I do think that this is the moment where something like that is not out of the realm of possibility. I'm not privy to inside conversations happening in these governments. I think it would astound me if they're not happening within governments like China, within governments like South Africa, within governments like Malaysia, Indonesia, and many others. It would be shocking to me. I would call it negligence to the highest order if they're not having these conversations. I'm not saying they're going to sound like me having them, but I would be shocked if they're not going right now and thinking, our reliance on the US is not sustainable. Our people, hate them. I mean, there is a tangible anti-American imperialism sentiment rising across the world now. I can't imagine politicians who are self-interested creatures are not looking at that and trying to think of ways they can mobilize that for their own political aspirations and goals and what have you. What is incumbent on us on the activist grassroots level is to direct that conversation in a direction that works for the people, not for the self-interest of these politicians. So I do think that we do need, on the grassroots level, to start to talk more openly about state interest. You know, in Canada, in the US, in the UK, in places like, in many other places around the world, there's the most prevalent strategy is a name and shame strategy that is trying to basically work the electoral politics element to get governments to take better positions on the question of Palestine. And that is effective, and that is good, and we should continue to do it. But I also think that we do need, on some level, to start to talk to the idea of state interest. And start to make the case for politicians, especially in the rare moments when they bring you into meetings, one-on-ones, in private meetings, to tell them why it is, in fact, in the state's interest to follow this path. And I think the two general headings that this can be developed under is to say, A, do you really want to continue to hitch your ride to American imperialism? They're taking hits left and right. And they're not going to last forever. Their internal politics are a mess. They're not going to self-correct anytime soon, if ever. They're going to be quite volatile. And maybe, yes, depending on the state that you're talking to, but for many states, you can say, maybe yes. You can sit on the sideline on the question of Palestine and say, I'll deal with the US problem later. Because you can do that. But this is also a particular moment. I'm coming towards the end. This is also a particular moment where you can now take this opportunity to do real challenge to American power. There is global grassroots sentiments that are quite strong. There are energies that are quite strong right now. And your moment to challenge American power is now, when that is on the rise. Not later, when you're the one paying the price when the Americans punish you for some other issue, and you don't have that attention, that global attention to it, then you have no really good chance at success. Now is the time to seize this energy on the grassroots, I would tell them, to form such coalitions and make bold moves on state level. And if not now, then when? I'll leave a lot of this, you know, I'm sure we'll get into a lot of the other details during our discussion, but I just wanted to hopefully leave you with the idea that Activism and action is not always sporadic, it's not always spontaneous, and the way that that's kind of like the public imagery of activism, that it's best when it's spontaneous. It's not. There is an art to it, an art and even a science, a combination of the two to it, that you should think about in your actions forward in order to achieve the ultimate goal, which is the liberation of Palestine. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Muhammad Ayyash. You made some very important points, and I'd like to just highlight one particular one, which is the coalition of states. I think that's probably the best takeaway from your discussion. Obviously, all the other points are very, very important too. At the risk of wasting more time, we have Professor Dr. Ramzi Baroud's video clip.
Hello, everyone. My name is Ramzi Baroud. I am a Palestinian writer and an academic, and the editor of PalestineChronicle.com. I was born and raised in a refugee camp in the Gaza Strip, particularly the Nusayrat refugee camp, which has been largely decimated by the Israeli military since the beginning of the genocide. Like many Gazans, of course, I have lost countless family members. And I say countless because we reached the point that we actually stopped counting because there were too many, and we're not really sure who is living and who is dead. Uh, but this is the reality of being a Palestinian, especially from Gaza, during this time. What I would like to talk about is how this war, starting with October 7th, has changed and will continue to change our perception of Palestine, the Palestinians, and the struggle for liberation, not only in Palestine, but in the global south as well. And by extension, how this change, this fundamental paradigm shift, in my opinion, is going to lead to a direct challenge to the dominance of Western capitalism and Western states that have been largely operating unhindered in their exploitation of the global south, its resources, its people, and so on. I would like to start from this particular comment by Joe Biden, by the American president, who said something interesting. He said, and this is a report that was published by the Axios website, and he said that it wasn't publicly said, but it was official transcript of comments he has made during an interview with a special counsel who was investigating his mishandling of official papers. He said that this Israel thing, and now he's talking about October 8th here in particular. So we haven't yet seen the genocide manifesting itself in the way it did in later days and weeks. But he's saying that this Israeli thing, meaning October 7th attack and the Israeli response, um, has changed it all. What he meant by that, he says that these events combined will determine, and these are his words, what the next 6, 7 decades look like. And I think that Biden, despite of his many lapses and old age, I do think that he has been quite correct in that assessment. When the president of the United States, immediately as someone as experienced as he is, he's been in power and politics for over 40 years, reaches a conclusion that this is going to change everything for the next 6, 7 decades, then we are talking about a paradigm shift. And we have been seeing this paradigm shift. It immediately manifested itself in the intervention of military intervention of non-state actors like Hezbollah in Lebanon, powerful non-state actors, the Houthis in Yemen, various Iraqi resistance groups in northern Iraq, and so on. The political map of the Middle East is changing. I have made an argument that those who are claiming that the Arabs are not united in defense of Gaza, I think they are wrong. I think that the Arabs are very much united. But the perception of that unity has a lot to do with how we define the Arabs. Traditionally, we see the Arabs as members of the Arab League, as official Arab states. And this is obviously wrong simply because many Arab states are revolving within an American political sphere. They are lackeys or allies or client regimes, whatever term that you would like to use, to America, and they are there to serve American interests. So to expect that these Arabs are going to kind of unify and create a line of defense for Palestinians and Palestinian resistance, it's just not only ridiculous. It really reflects not even deep but superficial understanding of what the Middle East is like and what are the political formations of the Middle East. There is no such thing as Arab political entity. There are Arab states that operate based on their interests. Some are floating within an American sphere, others are closer to Russia, others maintain a degree of independence. But to claim that there is such a thing as an Arab body politic that behaves in a unified fashion is just wrong and is ahistorical. However, there is a new type of Arab that is rising, and these are the Arabs of Yemen, Syria, Lebanon, Iraq, and other Arab groups that are also non-state actors in other polities. In addition, of course, to the Arab people who are there's this buffer between any possibility of action on their collective part and Gaza simply because the corrupt Arab regimes are there as this a layer of protection. In fact, speaking of protection, we know that when Bab el-Mandeb was shut down before Israeli ships by the Ansarullah groups, it was Arab countries that actually created a land route for Israel in order for them to receive badly needed supplies. So the Arabs are facilitating trade to Israel while the Americans and their Western allies are facilitating weapon shipments to Israel, in addition to the political cover and support. So some Arabs are actually kind of a lifeline, a direct lifeline that keeps feeding Israel so that it is able to carry on with its genocide against Gaza as far as long as possible. Now, if you are outraged by this, you should be, because there is a difference between weakness, failure, inability to communicate a cohesive political line and to support it with real action, and outright betrayal. In fact, in some cases, even outright treason. But you have the new Arabs who are forming a new front. They call it the unity of the squares, which is if one of us is hit, everybody else is going to respond. It's a fairly new concept, but we are seeing it in formation right now around Gaza. If it succeeds, and I think it is, and it will, I think it will definitely bring about a new type of politics to the Middle East, politics that challenges the traditional Arab politics and Arab governments and their benefactors in the West, in the capitalist Western world led by the United States. So this paradigm shift is there, is happening, and it's moving quite fast. And I think the end of the war, and I think again Biden is absolutely right. The end of the war, there is going to be a new political formation. You could easily grasp that through the new language or the evolution of language coming from the Russians and the Chinese and others. Where, for example, Russia in the very beginning had this kind of a middle ground position that has evolved with time to the point that on March 16th, the Russian ambassador to Israel was summoned by the Israeli government to be basically insulted, official insults. I don't know what's the term they use for that, by or reprimanded. That's the term. Reprimanded by the Israeli government because of the numerous statements that are being made by Russian officials, including Putin himself, Lavrov, but especially Zakharova as well, and of course the Russian representatives at the United Nations, particularly the Security Council. So these changes are happening and they are happening fast. I think we can actually comfortably talk about a real paradigm shift that is underway, and this could in fact lead to something major in the future. Now that takes me to the global south, particularly South Africa. I've been to South Africa several times, and every time I visited pretty much every major city and even some small towns throughout the country, which kind of made me somewhat familiar with the kind of political discourse that exists in South Africa, where you have this, growing, influential civil society organizations and groups that are close to the ruling party, to the ANC, and others who are trying to remind those in power in South Africa and Pretoria that you have to back up your words with action, and you need to actually start providing some tangible support for Palestinians that goes beyond the political discourse. And indeed, there was a lot of frustration that they felt, some of these organizations and individuals, they felt that the government did not, as of yet, reach that point where its political action is consistent with its somewhat evolving political stance. The post Gaza genocide, or the Gaza genocide rather, has helped, not only helped this new South African political discourse mature, but it really pushed it to the kind of limits that many of us did not expect. To that, we are immensely grateful. We are particularly grateful also because South Africa is now playing the role that countries like Cuba, for example, has played in the past, also in terms of its relationship to South Africa, meaning that they are serving not only the role of the liberated country, but also the role of a country with a regional a perspective of unifying the region around certain ideals, and an internationalist perspective, offering solidarity to other countries in Africa and around the world, including Palestine and the Palestinians, but of course, Angola, South Africa, among others. South Africa is now in that position. South Africa is playing this role. I think the consequences of this change, I think, is going to be lasting. I don't think it's superficial, and I think it's going to help in the birthing of this new global south. Now we have been talking about the new economic pacts like the BRICS group, for example, which includes South Africa, and its ability with time to serve as an alternative to the World Bank, to the IMF, to all these capitalist formations that have largely existed to ensure the dominance of the North and the South, to kind of basically over the South. It exists to to um, to impose this paradigm that has been around since and even prior to World War II, and that is to keep the South in its place, inferior forever, and the North, the benevolent North that is able to exploit at will, to manipulate the politics, to play games with money and funds and loans and that sort of thing. But ultimately, the relationship never ever changes. BRICS is changing that to some degree and will continue to change that. But in my opinion, I don't think groups like BRICS and others would have the power to maintain this momentum if they do not form a very strong and unified and political stance with a very clear political discourse. And I think what South Africa is doing right now is helping in the formation of that new political discourse, which is already influencing the BRICS group and will influence other kind of economic formations in the global south. So we are actually talking about Gaza, tiny, tiny little Gaza, 363 or 365 square kilometers, 181, I believe, square miles, that we have been told is very unimportant as far as the Arab Israeli conflict is concerned because it doesn't have territorial anything. And its wealth, its natural gas exists in the sea only, and Israel is able to easily exploit these resources without having to refer to Gaza's territory. So the territory itself is very, very important. For many years, I have argued that Gaza is arguably the most important Palestinian entity, even from a geopolitical point of view, because it has always been the capital of Palestinian resistance. And for Palestinians, resistance is their actual capital, not oil, not natural gas. The ability to say no, to reject oppression, to refuse the military occupation, and to fight back. And by extension, unify many other players around themselves. And we have seen that, or that is being manifested before our own eyes as we speak. And this is why Gaza is extremely important. And now we can also argue that Gaza is perhaps the most important geopolitical spot on earth right now, simply because, again, it per the words of Biden, it will change the world in the next for the next 6 or 7 decades. Now, I'm going to challenge that just a little bit. I'm going to say that actually Gaza is changing the world for since the last 100. I'm going to be very specific here. 107 years. I think I did the math correctly. Namely because of the Balfour Declaration, 1917. Lord Balfour of Great Britain, before even Britain had territorial control, before it occupied Palestine in 1917, later in that year, he issued a statement in which he granted Palestine, the land of Palestine, to the Zionist movement at the expense of the Palestinian people, of course. That was an earth shattering moment in the history of the region because it was the first time in which there was a practical kind of document in which, yes, Sykes-Picot a bit earlier, a few months earlier, divided the Middle East between various countries, but that it was more of the potential of that division. But Balfour Declaration treated Palestine as British territories to be granted through a deed, and the deed is the Balfour Declaration to some other nation coming from Europe. Since that day until today, we haven't really seen a time in which the West, in its entirety, been pushed back with the kind of ferocity that exists right now. This is not an attempt at undermining the various resistance movements that existed in the Arab world. Of course, there were so many of them, but we are talking about a moment in history in which the West is at its weakest. It is vulnerable. It is being embattled in Eastern Europe. Is being embattled economically because of the rise of China. It's being embattled technologically. It's being embattled in terms of the economic status that it has always had in relations to the global South and Asia and the rest of the world. And at that particular moment, October 7 takes place. And in that particular moment, the Middle East rises. And in that particular moment, countries like South Africa and other countries in the global South, including Brazil, Venezuela, and many others, traditional allies, but new allies, are all also rising in tandem to challenge that old order. It is absolutely an earth shattering moment. And this is why Israel has Netanyahu. Netanyahu is maybe brutal, and he is a war criminal, a genocide, someone who is capable not only of carrying out a genocide, but a famine and sustain it for a long time. But he's not stupid in the sense that he knew, and I think Biden knew, and I think Britain, France, Italy, and others, and Germany, particularly Germany, knew that there is something fundamental that is actually taking place in terms, not only in terms of the Arab-Israeli relationship or the Palestinian relationship with their Israeli occupiers, but also in terms of the West's relationship to the Middle East and by extension the rest of the world. And because of that, they all jumped in so very quickly. In the words of Nikki Haley, the infamous Nikki Haley, when she did that interview with Fox News and she looked at the camera telling Bibi, I don't know why we like to give him a nickname, uh, um, saying, finish them, finish them, finish them. She repeats 3 times, finish them, as finishing off the Palestinians in Gaza. Um, Another interesting statement was made by Moshe Feiglin, who at one point was one of the top leaders of the Likud party, when he said in an interview just a couple of days after after the Al-Aqsa flood operation, he said, what worries me the most, he said, is that Muslims are not afraid of us anymore. You see, so there is a psychological component. Not Gazans, not Palestinians, not Arabs, not Middle Easterns, but Muslims, all of Muslims. They're not afraid of us anymore because there's a wall, there's an actual war of psychological fear that Israel has planted throughout the years, and that wall has been breached, that wall has been destroyed, that connection has been severed, and now Muslims are not afraid of us anymore. All of these elements combined tell us that we are at the cusp of a historic opportunity to challenge Western dominance as manifesting itself in Palestine, to challenge Western manipulation of international law, to challenge Western financial hegemony over the Middle East, Africa, and the rest of the world, to challenge that haughtiness, this moral superiority that the West has imposed on the rest of us, where we are the only ones who are capable of carrying out war crimes and genocide, where our leaders are the only ones who are capable or possibly can be tried in international courts and institutions, while the West maintains that purity. In the words of Josep Borrell, when he said, racistly so, when he said that Russia, that Europe is like a garden and the rest of the world is a jungle, and it's their responsibility to protect this garden against those coming from the jungle. I mean, this is as racist as it gets, and we need to challenge all of this in terms of language, political discourse, legal institutions, and of course, in every other way. And the Palestinians are challenging that militarily as well. And by that, I mean the kind of weapons that have been used in Gaza. They are beyond our ability to even fathom. The fact that they are using the kind of weapons that would have destroyed or have created a total destruction in the infrastructure of an entire continent, and they are using it within this tiny little space called Gaza and still losing. Israel's weapons are becoming a joke. Is the Western support and intelligence are becoming a mockery, and all of that by a group of kids who develop their own weapons underground by themselves throughout the years. So even that component is being greatly challenged. I'm going to leave you at the hopeful thought and note that indeed we are living at this stage, but of change and fundamental and inshallah irreversible change. But to do that, we have to maintain our unity. We have to maintain the kind of unity that allows us to maintain our identities and our characters and our even our ideologies, but still find the common ground that makes us realize that we either rise together or fall together. Thank you very much for taking the time to listen to this. And I hope that it wasn't too much in terms of time. Ramadan Mubarak to everybody. Assalamu alaikum.
Thank you to, in his absence, Dr. Ramzi. He did apologize when he sent me the clip that he kept on touching his table in front of him. He didn't realize that the camera was shaking at the time. So my apologies, his apologies too. I will personally thank him for his input. And I find it interesting that he also talks about this coalition of nations that Professor Ayash referred us to earlier on. So there's kind of commonality in the kind of solutions that's now being proposed across the world. And I think it's very empowering to hear people like Dr. Ayash, Professor Ayash and Dr. Ramzi Baroud, who are starting to have the same kind of language being used across the world, and hopefully it will have the kind of impact that it should have. We're running short in time, and I'm going to ask Dr. Benson to perhaps for 15 minutes. I'd like to allow for a short Q&A if that's possible, bearing in mind that the Zohra is at 1 o'clock. Dr. Benson.
Thank you. It's really hard to follow. In some ways, I feel like we should just pause and reflect on what the previous two speakers have said. But let me dive in a little bit. I want to say thank you for the opportunity to be in conversation with you today. And the question posed of is humanity under siege from predatory capitalism and Western support for Israel is a difficult but a fundamental question for us to collectively address. And I say collectively address because I certainly don't have all the answers, but I wanted to take the opportunity to pause and work through some of the difficult and big underlying and vexing current debates around the framing of this struggle and these histories and a history of capitalism that I think is necessary for us. So in some ways, I thought I would talk about capitalism, confusion, and complicity. So we're 163 days into an ongoing genocide, and things have probably never been more clear and more complex at the same time. And from the start, and we could say the start as October 7th, 2023, or we could go back and say the start being the 2nd of November, 1917, the date of the Balfour Declaration. We could pick any other controversial date in between, but at the same time, there's always been people from any start who have said it's too complicated and too confusing to accurately describe a situation of two clear sides, and that has been their justification for not taking a side. But as the historian Howard Zinn says, you cannot be neutral on a moving train. And in fact, I think it's our moral duty to study and challenge the narratives around complexity as an excuse for apathy. So having said this, there's no doubt plenty to figure out. I'm not really a fan of public speaking, but I am a fan of collective study. And I think searching for the right words and listening to different people come and try to help us gain the tools and the words for arguing with all the people we have to strategically argue with, who we're going to argue with, is really important. And I think right now there's a lot of strategic confusion or appropriation or reconfiguring around the terms. And this comes up for us as South Africa Jews for a Free Palestine all the time. So I want to start with the word freedom and free, because it's really at the heart of capitalism, free markets, free choice, freedom struggles. And there was an SABC interview that was done 1 week ago where the DA leader, John Steenhuisen, said, it was actually misquoted in the tweets that went around, but what he said was this: we are not pro-Israel or pro-Palestine. We're pro-peace and anti-radicalization. It's not my role to call it genocide or determine if it's genocide. We have international courts for that. One side genocide could be another side's freedom fighting. Now, this is profoundly disturbing on many levels. One side's genocide could be another side's freedom fighting, especially given his suggested solution to not judge or to name what is going on as anything, to leave it to the courts, which we can and we are using, but we know will take years to deliberate. And until then, according to the DA, we must desist from naming what's going on as anything, which means we must let a genocide unfold, because after all, this might be another side's freedom struggle. Now, in the USA, according to the Anti-Defamation League, which is a pro-Israeli group with the stated mission of fighting anti-Semitism and other forms of racism in the United States, they say Zionism means supporting a Jewish state established for the protection of Jews worldwide. So as South African Jews for a Free Palestine, we refuse this protection. We don't want this protection, and we challenge this idea of protection. Now, starting over a decade ago, the SAJFP is an organization of anti-Zionist Jews drawing from our understanding of the responsibilities as Jews to stand up for justice, including for the total liberation of the Palestinian people. And we stand in solidarity with Palestine against the brutalities of Israel, backed by the US and Zionists worldwide. In 1979, James Baldwin wrote, "The state of Israel was not created for the salvation of the Jews. It was created for the salvation of Western interests. The Palestinians have been paying for the British colonial policy of divide and rule and for Europe's guilty Christian conscience for more than 30 years." This was in the 1980s. Now, this divide and rule continues to mutate every single day, making further and further divisions, and this complicating or appropriating of the terms of the debate in its wake. So as SAJFP, we know that anti-Semitism is real, but the move to conflate anti-Zionism or any critique of the state of Israel with anti-Semitism is to cover up the racist roots of Zionism and its foundational ideas that we need a Jewish homeland to be safe. This form of safety through oppression, in our opinion, is a breeding ground for anti-Semitism. But the weaponization of fear to redefine the ground and the sides capitalizes on terms like anti-Semitism, and it distorts a history of what freedom fighting means and what freedom requires. In our opinion, and as we repeat at our Passover Seders every year, no one is free until everyone is free. And for us, never again means never again for anyone. So I want to go into a bit of the history of this system, which is called settler colonialism and racial capitalism, and it's being defended to the death by Netanyahu and his regime. So if we look a little bit at capitalism and freedom, historically speaking, fights for freedom have always been fights against capitalism, and colonialism is what expands and entrenches capitalist extension. And capitalism feeds off of racism and sexism, and these things are interconnected and they are messy. We see it in all of the debates around gender-based violence and the conflict at the moment. So Annalene Dejin is an author of a book called Freedom, An Unruly History that was published by Harvard in 2020. And she looks at the history of the split in the definition of the word freedom by liberals and conservatives and how it is used. She says, we tend to think of freedom as an emancipatory ideal, and for good reason. Throughout history, the desire to be free inspired countless marginalized groups to challenge the rule of political and economic elites, from slavery to colonialism to apartheid, etc., calling for self-government and self-determination. But there's always been another side to the story of freedom as well. And here she speaks of American history, which I'm going to go with because of the role of the US in arming and abetting the current onslaught of Palestinians. Over the past 250 years, there's been a cry for liberty that has been used by conservatives to defend elite interests. So in their view, true freedom is not about collective control over government. It consists of the private enjoyment of one's life and goods. And so from this perspective, preserving freedom has little to do with making governments accountable to its people. It has to do with protecting the right to private property. And I'm gonna skip a little bit, but I think we get the point that the language and the terms of the debate have always been contested and used to justify, which is why the Zionists are saying that they are protecting us as Jews worldwide from anti-Semitism by having control over occupied Palestine. And in the US, conservatives have always been eager to claim that they alone are the defenders of freedom. They believe that this is about protecting property rights. And I think we have to look a little bit at the idea of property and of capitalism if we want to understand freedom struggles and anti-colonial struggles. Now, Robin Kelley, the American historian, I think explains it best when he gives an overview of a history of capitalism. And often we hear the term capitalism thrown around as if we know what it means. And I think going back to how it was started and how it spread and how it continues to spread is really important. Many of us were not lucky enough to be around when there was a viable worldwide alternative to capitalism being put on the table. And so we grow up in a world where capitalism is as natural as the air. Now, capitalism, as we know, is born of dispossession, stripping people from their lands and turning people either into the dispossessed or into settlers. And it's a long ongoing history, but what Robin Kelly points out is the work that it took to create what was called a white working class, to create settlers who considered themselves white and considered themselves settlers, not immigrants coming to a new place on the terms of the place they land, but settlers going to take and grab and dispossess and control, oftentimes done in the name of freedom, finding newfound freedoms, and often running from old oppressions. I think that this is important in the way that Shahabuddin has framed the questions for today about predatory capitalism and Western interests in Israel. And as we saw, Barut was speaking about the West and the importance of this moment in terms of challenging world history. So Robin Kelly shows us how in the US, for example, in the first phase of the expansion of settler colonialism, there was a coercion of independent immigrants, some of whom would have been living quite harmoniously or in collaboration or in cooperation with indigenous people. How did they become settlers? Well, they were given the rights as settlers to certain pieces of land only for the complicity in investing in violent dispossession. And these two things are combined. Capitalism is a zero-sum game. There's only one pie. If I have 90%, there's only 10% in this system left. And the two are constantly connected. And so almost everything that we eat and wear and see and do is at the exploitation and expense of someone else, somewhere else, even if we can't see them. And the ways in which racism is then tied into both creating the dispossessed and the privileged is something important to go back to when we're arguing around why, as anti-Zionist Jews, we see Zionism as colonial racism that needs to be fought here in South Africa as well as Israel. So if we look at anti-Semitism, Zionism, and some of the myths of Jewish freedom, the Jewish Israeli historian Ilan Pappé makes the important point that it wasn't the war of 1948 that resulted in Palestinians first becoming refugees, but rather that was part of a much longer Zionist master plan created in the 1880s, meant to complete an ethnic cleansing project that started way before World War II. So in other words, Zionist forces were already expelling Palestinians before World War II. And it's a very important example that shows that, like capitalism, Zionism has to be sold and forced on people because it was not popular. Most Jews disagreed with Zionism. Zionism was a fringe idea. In the 1880s, there were maybe about 15% of Jews who agreed with Zionism. Even by the 1930s, most Jews in Europe did not agree with Zionism. Zionism is a form of Jewish nationalism predicated on the idea of needing a Jewish-only state on Palestinian land. And that's a form of settler colonialism. And as all settler colonies go, you have two choices of which side you are on and who you become, generally in that story. So as SAJFP, we see Zionism as racism and as a tool of racial capitalism, which inevitably will there will be an oppression by first-class citizens over second-class citizens. Zionism is what drives the Israeli government system of apartheid and dispossession, and it has been doing so for the last 75 years. And for the last 75 years, there have been anti-Zionist Jews. Of course, we are then accused of being self-hating Jews or not real Jews or anti-Semitic Jews, etc. And Pappé shows how the War of 1948 was really the means to the dispossession in order to settle. So refugees were not a byproduct of a war, but the point of the war. And Zionism continues to sell these acts as self-defense. So for example, Patrick Wolf, the famous historian of settler colonialism, puts it this way. He says, settler colonialism is not an event, it is a structure. And it's important because we see the same structures behind the 1948 dispossession, the catastrophic Nakba, behind the current dispossession, which Pape points out is worse because it's not even just a chasing out, but it's a murderous genocide. So again, Zionism sells these acts as self-defense, and history shows us that colonial promises of security are in Israel and everywhere promises of violence. And I think that we also have to challenge the way that the word violence is thrown around. Are you nonviolent? Do you condone violence? These are the kinds of things that get thrown at us. And I think it's a really common colonial strategy. So for example, P.W. Botha offered to release Mandela in 1985, or maybe even before that. But they offered to release Mandela on the condition that he renounces violence. And Mandela's reply was delivered by his daughter Zinzi at the Jabulani Stadium in Soweto in 1985. And this is what he said. He said, let him, this is Botha, renounce violence. Let him renounce violence. Let him say that he will dismantle apartheid. So likewise, most Jews in the 1800s and into the 1930s rejected Zionism, saying that this was not something that was Jewish. It did not flow naturally from Judaism. And in fact, SAJFP would argue that it goes against the core values of Judaism. And we work to expose and resist the racist roots of Zionism and the foundational idea that we need a Jewish homeland to be safe. This is a form of safety through oppression, and in our opinion, it then breeds further anti-Semitism. I would recommend that anyone who hasn't looked at Ilan Pape's book read it, because I can't go into the details of the kind of Zionist workings and plans in the 1880s through what he calls the village files that have been declassified information. But I think it's really important to look at the ways in which Israel has to find Jewish victims, even has to create Jewish victims in order to then justify a form of safety. And it's really important that we call out the ways that Jewish trauma, especially from the Holocaust, has been used to weaponize and to justify the occupation and oppression of Palestinians who had absolutely nothing to do with Nazi Germany. Naomi Klein, who's an anti-Zionist Jewish political writer, from Canada, she writes in her new book called Doppelganger about how the horrific genocide in the Holocaust has been given a special status that justifies colonial occupation and all the brutality that it entails in a twisted form of reparation. So again, the words freedom are being twisted. And I think that this is important because we see the Nazis and their racist eugenics as a continuum of European settler colonial project. And that is what we have to reckon with. Hitler himself even said that the idea for the concentration camps came from the British colonists in South Africa and in Namibia, where Germans first practiced a genocide right here in response to resistance to land dispossession by the Nama and the Herero in 1905. So these practices were then imported back to Europe. And the problem happens that when the British and the Americans are now framed as the good guys who freed the Jews from the Holocaust, their entire long settler colonial history gets washed away. And Naomi Klein points out how this is then used to dismiss the imperial legacies, which Israel continues to defend today. And many Zionists at the end of World War II were also making the argument that Jews earned the right to the exception of the decolonial consensus at the time to say that because of our near extermination and victimization and vulnerability, we now had the right or the privilege to go and do the same thing in Palestine. And I think unpacking these histories is really important because otherwise, what gets thrown at us are these ideas that you are then betraying a long-fought freedom of having a place that you can call a safe home. Even in the ICJ case, we see how Israel spun itself leaning hard on a twisted capitalist colonizing vision of society, saying that they are this safety zone. We think anti-Semitism is indeed real, but we have to figure out how to transcend the trauma of the Holocaust, which was a life-defining experience of anti-Semitism, and there have been many other experiences since, in ways that don't then reproduce that kind of oppression. So currently, we can jump now to the present in South Africa, and we see that these ideas of Israel being a safe and special place are sold back here. So in April, there's going to be Open Day, and I'll read you the ad. It says, "Home in Israel, one-stop shop coming to South Africa from the 3rd to the 11th of April, 2024, offering your real estate solutions all under one roof." So capitalism is hungry, and it is endless. And Zionists continue to use fear of anti-Semitism even by creating those threats and then calling anyone who opposes traitors, terrorists, defamation, etc. And in this repackaging, the words and concepts are not academic. They actually determine who lives and who dies. I'm almost done. I think the work ahead requires for us separating Zionism from Judaism and reclaiming Judaism from Zionism and linking anti-Zionist struggles to the struggle for Palestinian liberation and to anti-capitalist struggles worldwide. Anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, they all feed off of capitalist power structures. And just like in South Africa, where there were arguments made that we cannot just get rid of a racist government, we have to get rid of a capitalist government, otherwise we will have the same forms of oppression. Likewise in Palestine as we struggle forward. As anti-Zionist Jews, we believe in building a Judaism beyond Zionism and a world free of colonialism and white supremacy, because there's no peace without liberation. And it's hard work, it's complicated and relentless. It's actually quite exhausting, as you said, and it's on purpose exhausting. It's meant to exhaust us, and I think we have to find ways to come together to fight that. The US is assuming that the world is its playground and wanting to control both land and narrative. And I think we need to refuse. We need to refuse and do the work of repair. It's the only way for us to be safe. The novelist Zadie Smith said, "Time is how you spend your love." So thank you for spending your time here with us today to do the ever important and necessary work of better understanding for better action. So I wish you all a Ramadan Kareem. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Connie, for your contribution. Very important points. Connie's been at the forefront almost of the fight from amongst the Jewish community to highlight the issue of Zionism. And as we now know, and maybe I'm going to ask her if you would allow us to perhaps publish your talk today in the Muslim Views in series. I think there's about 25 pages there. So we'll see. We'll have a chat later on. All right, so I don't want to spend too much more time because it's 1:45 now, and the Adhan goes off at 1 o'clock. I'm going to allow for about 5 questions or so, so we can finish at around 5 to 1. Are there any questions? One day.
Thank you so much to the panel. I really enjoyed it.
Can you just give your name first?
Khadija. I just wanted to know, and it's referring to the issue around this coalition of states boycotting the Zionist entity. I'm looking at BRICS, and you've been mentioning BRICS. Dr. Ramzi Baroud also mentioned them. But can they provide those alternatives to the United States? Of course, you also have to consider the emergence of this multipolar world that was in discussion, a lot of talk about it, especially now with Russia and what's been happening with China. So how do you foresee where the BRICS could possibly be that almost catalyst for that coalition of states that boycott the United States?
Can we take one more question? Is one day? just while we're waiting, Khadija was on that flotilla a number of years ago. I'm not quite sure what year it was. In 2010, she was on the flotilla trying to deliver supplies to Gaza at the time when the Zionist movement invaded the flotilla and shot and killed a number of people. She was one of the people on the flotilla. Next question. Your name, please.
My name is Zunaid. Thank you for the very interesting presentations we've had so far. Question for Professor Ayash. I think your idea about a coalition of states is absolutely correct as far as the strategy is concerned for the future. However, I wonder if you think that the either two-state or one-state solution could be a major point of contention in the formation of this coalition. You know, there are those of us who feel that the only solution for Palestine is a South African solution.
One-state solution.
Exactly, and that you live in one country, but you have to give up this idea that you're superior to someone else.
Thank you. Can we take one more, if there is another one? All right, we'll ask the panel to.
Okay, so very quickly, because we don't have time. In my view, and Ramzi mentioned this too, BRICS is still a long way away from creating an alternative economic system where states are no longer dependent on the U.S. empire. So the idea that I have is, okay, well, if the alternative is not that far away, make it so that in the current system, the U.S. would have more to lose than gain if they punish such a coalition. So in a sense, you're trying to tie their hands without changing the system. Now, that's not a long-term solution, but that can, I think, speed up the long-term solution, which is something like BRICS, which is the emergence of these alternative economic institutions. So this can actually speed up that process, but that process is still a long ways away. Let's not kid ourselves. There will still be dependent on Western imperial economic power for the foreseeable future. So that's kind of the thinking, is to just change a calculation within the existing system in the meantime. And in terms of your question, it is an excellent question. You know, I'm certainly on the no partition framework, non-partition framework, whether it's one state, no state, or whatever version of the one state there is. There's multiple versions of what a one state would look like. But I'll tell you what, there are certain versions of the two state that a bunch of people would take right now over this. So I actually don't think that it is necessary for a final word on that in order for such a coalition to emerge. The coalition would just say that their goal is to force the Israeli state off the path of genocide and mass expulsion of the Palestinians and the recognition of Palestinian sovereignty. How that then plays out will be a matter for negotiations between Palestinians and Israelis, with that coalition being a force now within such a negotiation. That can transpire in a number of different directions. I know which side I would be fighting on in that, but at this moment, we'll take anything other than this. There are versions of the two-state solution that I think, if they are implemented, would eventually lead to a one-state solution. So it's not, to me, also a matter of either or. There are paths where you can structure a two-state solution in such a way where you're like, after 20 or so years, I can easily see how this turns into a one-state solution. That's also a possible path, too. But certainly the two-state solution, as Israel understands it, as the Americans understand it, as the UK understand it, that's a non-starter. So let's just make that clear. And I do believe that the majority of the world who would be part of this coalition understand a two-state solution very differently than those. Just look at their speeches at the International Court of Justice on not the genocide case, the other one, on the illegality of the Israeli occupation. They're talking about full self-determination. Decolonization, though they don't use the term, they called Israel a colonial state many, many times. China used colonial domination numerous times. So there's a much better understanding of what a meaningful two-state solution that I think would eventually lead to a one-state solution would look like by such a coalition.
Connie, comments?
No, I don't. I think I don't need to comment because the questions were for the speakers.
Okay. Any other questions? Anybody? Yes, one. Can we have the mic, please?
Hi, I'm Elma. We are trying, I lived in the Middle East for 9 years. We are trying to keep up to date with academic resources on the conflict. But because we are no longer students, as you can see, we have to drive all the way to Stellenbosch University Library, and we can take out only 3 books at a time. And some of the articles that are on the catalogue of the university website, we can only access if we were students. Is there any other way that we could access some of the articles? I have been to on the website of this university where you are, but for us as elderly people in an old age home, to access these heavy academic articles that would give you that that has proper bibliographies and stuff, it is very difficult to access those. So is there any way that we could have more free access to the latest articles on the topic, please?
Okay. One more question. There's one here.
Just a quick one. Is there any hope of de-Zionizing Judaism? Zionism has essentially hijacked Judaism for the last century and a bit. Maybe not too relevant to today's topic, but is there any hope? And also maybe something for Muslims to reflect on, you know, how politics and religion sort of the intersectionality and how the one hijacks the other, etc., and the lip service paid, you know, by Muslim global political leaders, but very, very little done on the ground.
Okay.
And I mean, just a personal comment of how the Gazans are showing us, you know, action through faith. That for me, you know, religion was essentially a religiously or God-inspired social movement, and we've sort of politicized Islam to such an extent that, you know, 2 billion Muslims, and there's so little we can do for Gaza. But back to the original question, is there any hope of Judaism
Being
shrugging off this yoke of
de-Zionized? Right, we got 2 questions. One is the resources. Connie, would you?
Yeah, sure. You can have my password to the UWC library. Don't record that part. But there are actually also, I have to say, that there's amazing podcasts at the moment. I don't know if you've ever started listening to them, but once you do, it's quite amazing because you could hear interviews like with people like Munad, with people who are doing the cutting edge research or who are making their syllabuses. Like there's a podcast called East Is, and it's these people at Duke University who are teaching on Palestine, but they've turned their whole syllabus into open source with recorded interviews with each author. And so they're digging up all sorts of resources. So I mean, I've learned a lot in that way, but yeah, there's definitely ways to get passwords to university things. They should be public anyways, and yeah, we can figure that out. The other thing is also to insist that the public libraries, you know, they order books. All the books you see there, they order them. They have a national budget, and you can make requests for particular topics and things like that. In terms of de-Zionizing Judaism or decolonizing Judaism, it's absolutely important. I can't say that we are a gigantic movement. There's Anthony and Caitlin are also here today, but South Africa Jews for a Free Palestine is part of an international attempt at reclaiming Judaism from Zionism. And in some ways it is a political act, but there is also the act of rejuvenation. So we host Shabbat Against Genocide every Friday night and have since October 7th, because even the progressive synagogues are standing up on the side of Israel. So we've been having conversations within the synagogues, and you know, but those spaces when they fall on when they embrace Zionism, then they embrace racism, and it's not a place to be able to actually practice Judaism. And so there's amazing, we'll be hosting a Liberation Passover Seder. We hosted our own Tu B'Shvat, which was the birthday for the trees, but what we did was it was dedicated against ecocide and greenwashing. And so we use these as political education spaces, but also as spaces to revisit our prayers, and prayers for reparation, prayers for Gaza's children, prayers for reconciliation and the internal work that needs to be done. So it's not huge, but it is there, and we also have been in conversation with similar anti-Zionist Jews in Argentina, in the Netherlands. You see Jewish Voices for Peace and Rabbis for Ceasefire in the US. Those movements came out of a decade of internal political education within quite liberal and probably fence-sitting Zionist organizations, and over time have really pushed to create an alternative. I know in the past, growing up, and almost all of us grew up in Zionist communities, and you come to a point where you realize the hypocrisies and need to do something about it, and then you turn and find so many other anti-Zionist Jews throughout history that often had to make the decision, well, you're either with us or against us, and therefore you find many anti-Zionist Jews who have had to give up their Judaism, and then they're just an activist. They're an anti-apartheid activist, let's say, but they don't get taken seriously as a Jew. And I think for us, Judaism is a practice that we don't need to throw the baby out with the bathwater. There's important history and tradition, but when it seeps into reproducing oppression, sexism, racism, and the oppression of Palestine, then it's not something we can accept. So we're trying in our own small way to do that work, but there's lots more to be done.
I'll take one more question. Thank you, Connie. One more question, if there is. There isn't. Thank you very much to the panelists. It was, I think, very enlightening. We have recorded this. It will be broadcast live. Those of our family members and neighbors and so on who might want to view this, it'll be on Hilal TV. We'll let you know via social media when it's going to be broadcast. Dr. Parker? Oh, yes. Just the last few comments about next week, Sunday, and the following Sunday's programs, and the panelists.
Yeah, first of all, let me just say that the couple sitting here in front, the ardent students, age is not a criteria because they are possibly one of the more regular visitors to Academia Library. And in fact, my words to them when I saw them earlier, I haven't seen you in the library for the last couple of days. And they turned around and they told me, well, we haven't seen you. So, and let me also say that maybe it should be the responsibility of the Academia Library also to avail the type of articles that you are talking about, that you are searching. A password, to get into the university annals of history and scripts, is obviously an option. But at the end of the day, libraries are there to provide the information to one and all. So we're continuing next week on Sunday with the second topic. And again, hopefully we will not have the type of issues to deal with, and we'll start on time. And we'll possibly have more time, to have more questions, because at the end of the day, in my opinion, it is the questions that brings about the type of clarity on issues beyond what the speakers deliver. So next week on Sunday at 11 o'clock, we'll have, once again, I'm just trying to get to the exact topic. Yeah, on the 24th of March, we've got victimhood, the disruptive power of words and the role of Western media and the control of the narrative and the discourse. And I think we have to agree that for far too long have the narrative been scripted for us, have we been told what we need to believe, have we been shown what we need to be seen. And I think, it is by time that we need to construct our own narrative. We need to go into our own political, historical perspectives and provide the solutions as we see it, the way we want to see it, or not be led by the Western media that shape and control the minds and the views of people. And for that, we've got a very compelling panel. Where are we now? The first person would be Brother Khalid Wahid, who is a social media activist as well as a specialist. We've got Raisa Pether, a renowned journalist. And then we've got Professor Junaid Ahmed from the United States of America. The last Sunday, the 31st of March, a very contestable discussion that we touched on very briefly here today, unfolding scenarios for Palestine in the quest for justice and peace. Is there a solution in sight? And clearly the question comes to mind, are we talking of a one-state, a two-state, or a no-state solution? The speakers there would be Professor Ilan Pape, a renowned anti-Jewish, anti-Zionist proponent, Ambassador Ibrahim Rasool, and Sheikh Riyad Walsh, who is an ardent investigator and a proponent, on research matters regarding the Nakba. I want to take this opportunity to thank you one and all, and please do spread the word around that we will have similar talks, these 2 talks, as I announced the topic for next week on Sunday, as well as the last Sunday, the 31st of March. Please do have a safe journey home. For those that are fasting, enjoy the rest of this blessed month. And on your way out, visit the Academia Library table, zap out the card, make a contribution to Academia Library. Thank you, Jazakallah, Assalamu alaikum, and good afternoon to one and all.